Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are strapping into our 19th century time machine. We're going to take a pretty profound shortcut, I think, into the mind of a radical revolutionary.
A really radical one.
Our destination is 1846, and we're looking at a searing, relentless critique of faith and political power. It's known as an apology for atheism.
And this is a document that, well, it pulls no punches at all. The author, Charles Southwell, he sets the stakes immediately with this really explosive claim that frames our entire deep dive.
Which is what, exactly?
That religious error isn't some harmless private folly. He says it's the real intangible root, the very substratum of all political injustice.
Wow. So that's the core ambition here, then. He's not just arguing for non-belief. He's basically creating a philosophical weapon for political freedom.
That's a perfect way to put it. We're analyzing a blueprint for tearing down oppressive systems by starting at the foundational belief structure.
And we're going to challenge the very concept of a supreme being using the strict logic of philosophers like David Hume and Baruch Spinoza. We'll explore why atheists were viewed by the public as, monstrous and bloodthirsty.
And maybe most crucially, we'll uncover some shocking historical examples where piety was used to justify just horrific political cruelty.
So what's our focus here? How are we tackling this?
Our focus is strictly on distilling Southwell's powerful address, which he directed pointedly at religious investigators of every denomination. To do that justice, we have two sort of massive analytical paths to cover.
Okay.
First, we had to analyze the inherently political character of all organized religions. He specifically critiques Protestantism and Romanism in his context.
And a second path.
The second is exploring his detailed argument for the philosophical necessity of what he calls absolute atheism. And this is all grounded in these unyielding principles of reason and experience.
So our mission is really to guide you, the listener, through this very detailed historical and, I have to say, highly combative argument.
Exactly. And to make sure you capture the core, uncomfortable aha moments that I think still resonate today in any discussion about faith and governance.
All right, let's dive in.
Let's do it.
So let's unpack that central political thesis first, because it really gives the apology its revolutionary bite.
It really does.
Southwell insists that religious faith has this important bearing on all life relations. He argues that the connection between faith and political practice is, and this is a quote, far closer than is generally thought.
Right. It's not just a moral influence in his view. He genuinely believes that religious error is the intangible but real substratum of all political injustice.
So if you want to fix a corrupt political system, you can't just change the laws.
No, you have to start deeper. You have to fix the religious foundation that the whole thing is standing on. He sees religious faith as the intellectual infrastructure that upholds corrupt power.
That's a powerful idea.
It is. He argues that reformers constantly fail because they're only treating the symptoms, the bad laws, the corrupt officials. They never realize the systemic nature of the belief structure underneath it all.
And in his view, a people who are, what's the phrase he uses?
In the fetters of superstition.
Right. A people in the fetters of superstition can never achieve political freedom.
Exactly. They are intellectually enslaved long before they're politically enslaved.
He has this perfect quote that captures this idea. He references a contemporary anti-state church association meeting, and he notes that throw what we would into the political cauldron, out it came in an ecclesiastical shape.
I love that quote. It suggests that no matter how secular you try to make a political process, it just keeps resolving back into a religious conflict or a religious structure.
It's the ultimate zero-sum game for him.
It is. He suggests that if you examine any major political issue of his time, you find the church, or maybe more accurately, the priesthood, is always involved. They're either defending established power or they're controlling the debate.
Why does that happen, according to him?
Because established faith teaches people to accept authority without question. It teaches them to value obedience over intellect.
Yeah.
And to rely on divine intervention rather than, human action.
And that kind of mindset is just politically toxic.
Absolutely.
That is an incredibly sweeping condemnation of all clergy, though. And he doesn't spare anyone in this critique, does he? He goes after both Romanism and Protestantism, calling them a political system and a wicked political system.
He does.
Doesn't he risk alienating potential allies by attacking both major denominations like that? I mean, Was there no recognition of genuine good work, philanthropic work being done by religious groups?
Southwell is concerned with power structures, not individual kindness. He sees organized religion, it doesn't matter what the denomination is, as an instrument of statecraft and control.
And what's the specific charge he levels against them?
Neglect. Neglect driven by ambition. He argues that both systems regard only the exercise of power and neglect utterly the duty of improvement.
Meaning, they prioritize their own influence and their own authority over the genuine betterment of the people they're supposed to be serving.
Precisely. For him, they are instruments of stultification. They deliberately stand in the way of knowledge because they understand that intellectual freedom is the necessary precursor to political freedom.
So it's a strategy, keep people in the dark.
A deliberate one. The cunning few, Southwell warns, make a market of delusion, and their grand object is to rivet the chains of others. If you keep the population ignorant and dependent on faith for all their answers, you secure your own political and financial power. It's that simple.
To give us a really visceral illustration of this thesis, Southwell draws on the suffering of the time, like a catastrophic 1845 potato crop failure in Ireland.
The Irish famine, yes.
He uses it as a stunning case study in the direct link between religious education and political fatalism. He's arguing it was a consequence of a faith that undermined critical thought and forethought.
This is a really powerful, and I have to say uncomfortable analysis. The government commission at the time, it was composed of celebrated practical chemists, and they published scientific suggestions on how to mitigate the calamity.
Things like how to preserve the good parts of the potato root and render the tainted parts safe.
Exactly, through specific chemical processes. But Southwell observes that the qualities required to actually carry out these suggestions, he lists care, the diligence, the persevering industry, were precisely the things in which the Irish peasantry were most deficient.
And he argues their deficiencies stem directly from their religious education.
Absolutely. The fatalistic response from the peasantry was chillingly simple. The source quotes them saying, "Sure, the Almighty sent the potato plague, and we must bear it as well as we can."
So this resigned acceptance, this belief that a superior power inflicted the plague and therefore human effort was just useless.
It prevented them from implementing the scientific remedies that were right there available to them. Others, instead of using diligence, resorted to magical thinking. They relied on copious sprinklings of holy water on the potato gardens.
So he sees the resulting famine not just as an agricultural disaster, but as a moral and intellectual failure fostered by the church.
Yes, this profound lack of forethought, so remarkable, and indolence so abominable, is explicitly characterized by Southwell as a direct result of their religious education. It taught them to rely on providence rather than industry.
He says they were trained like a dog.
To lick the hand that smites them. That's his phrase. And this is why he believes that even if the Irish people achieved political independence or repeal without a religious purging, they would still just be tools of political mountebanks and priests. The political system would just keep its ecclesiastical shape.
If that's the political result of the established religious system, a state of learned helplessness, then any attempt to introduce secular improvement would naturally be met with furious resistance by the clergy.
It would have to be.
And that brings us to the famous controversy over the godless colleges established by Sir Robert Peel.
Indeed. A great outcry was raised against these colleges, and the reason was simple. Religion formed no part of the curriculum.
And the clergy, both Romanist and Protestant.
They were terribly alarmed lest those colleges should spoil the craft by which they live. The core argument really hinges on the preservation of ignorance. Whatever influence the clergy possessed, the author says, must vanish with the ignorance on which it rests. Knowledge is the only solvent.
The opposition was immediate and extreme, wasn't it? Sir Robert Inglis famously called the measure a gigantic scheme of godless education.
He did, and the Catholic prelates pronounced it dangerous to faith and morals.
So why was a simple college bill viewed as this kind of political existential threat?
Because the author views this Irish colleges bill as the fine point of that wedge, which, driven home, will shiver to pieces their wicked political system. It threatened to introduce secular, verifiable knowledge into the national intelligence of Ireland.
Right. Southwell insists that improving the Irish intellect will inevitably play the mischief with its faith.
And for the clergy, faith is the political system. If people learn to reason scientifically, they will necessarily reject the superstition that forms the basis of priestly power. Southwell argues they didn't object to the colleges because they were bad schools, but because they were schools at all.
And that really highlights the core political message here. True liberty requires intellectual emancipation first.
That's the foundation of his entire argument.
So if religion is the poison, Southwell has to prove that his proposed cure isn't actually worse than the disease. Let's pivot now and define atheism, not as the angry public saw it, but as this philosophical treatise frames it.
A very important distinction.
Atheists, according to this argument, believe religion is either a cunningly and in part a stupidly devised fable. They believe that supernaturalism, when it's systematized, is necessarily wickedly political.
And this treatise frames atheism not as a mere negation, not just saying no to God, but as a constructive, revolutionary source.
What do you mean by that?
Atheism, in Southwell's formulation, is the essential precursor to political freedom. Philosophy itself is the irresistible genius of universal emancipation.
So that's the core revolutionary identity. Atheism isn't about destruction, it's about clearing the ground of superstition and delusion to enable rational governance and human progress.
Exactly. They put no trust in doctrine which involves or assumes supernatural existence. Their entire system relies purely on verifiable experience and reason.
And yet, the popular view was violently different. It was fueled by what the text calls the imputation weapon.
A very effective weapon.
Atheism was viewed by the majority as an inhuman, bloody, ferocious system and the inseparable ally of most shocking wickedness. This was a powerful tool in political debate.
It was the ultimate, immediate slur, the philosophical equivalent of a political dirty bomb. Southwell points out that scarcely a metaphysical writer of any eminence escaped the accusation.
And it was often used illogically, right? Just as an insult to discredit their rational arguments.
Completely. Even intellectual giants, who were certainly not atheists, people like Clarke, Leibniz, Newton, and Locke, they were all called atheists by sharp-sighted divines, simply for deviating from narrow orthodoxy in their philosophical explanations.
That just shows the charge was a way to stop intellectual debate dead in its tracks.
Precisely. He even offers this bizarre example of Confucius being denounced as an atheist by a bishop who knew no Chinese.
And what was Confucius's crime?
Simply for saying, the sky has given me virtue and man can do me no hurt. The logic was non-existent. If you used reason over revelation, you were an atheist. It demonstrates that the term was a rhetorical tool used to brand anyone who deviated from the current dogma, regardless of their actual beliefs about a deity. It was a mechanism of intellectual control.
Okay, but here's where it gets really interesting. The text uses the specific example of what it calls the Hume paradox to just shatter this vulgar notion that atheism necessitates wickedness or a lack of talent.
Yes, David Hume.
The author calls him a true atheist, and he was noted for being fast in friendship, generous in disposition, and blameless in all the relations of private life.
And this is a powerful, real-world rebuttal to centuries of conditioning that insisted non-belief meant inevitable moral corruption.
Absolutely. The source quotes a contemporary critic detailing the contrast and the parallel between Hume and the devout Presbyterian historian William Robertson.
And they flourished in the same society, were similar in their habits and generous dispositions.
And equally pure in their morals and blameless in all the relations of private life.
It's hard to overstate how revolutionary that friendship must have looked in 1846. To see the devout man and the most absolute atheist maintaining this high moral ground together, it just pulls the rug out from under centuries of cultural conditioning that insisted morality has to be divinely inspired.
It really does.
The very fact that they maintained a close and warm friendship, while both were demonstrably pure in their morals, completely refutes that vulgar notion that atheism requires a lack of talent or virtue, or that belief is somehow necessary for social function.
So Hume's very existence proved that moral excellence can coexist.
And even flourish, with a total rejection of religious faith. Southwell uses this to prove that piety is not an indicator of virtue, and non-piety is certainly not an indicator of vice.
So the author felt compelled to address the inherent unpopularity of atheism, right? I mean, in the 19th century, it was a fringe belief.
Very fringe.
How does the treatise challenge the argument from general consent? The idea that something must be true because the majority believes it.
He dismisses this argument from numerical majority with astonishing contempt. He cites the Edinburgh Review's description of the majority of every nation as rude, uneducated masses, ignorant, intolerant, suspicious, unjust, and uncandid.
That sounds incredibly elitist, though. He's essentially writing off the entire concept of vox populi, the voice of the people.
He is. He argues it is folly to presume a speculative heresy is worse for being unpopular. If the majority are characterized as intolerant and unjust, why on earth would we assume that their deeply held speculative notions are true?
So he thinks the common road is dangerous.
Yes. He believes truth requires the rejection of currently accepted opinions. A prudent searcher after truth should view a current opinion with distrust for the very reason that it is the current one. This is a powerful argument for intellectual iconoclasm, regardless of how controversial the claims are.
So for him, unpopularity is essentially a badge of honor for the thinker who is willing to reject the ignorance of the crowd in favor of reason.
Precisely. Southwell implies that those who insist that vox populi is the voice of God are open to the charge of ascribing to God the very qualities that Orthodox pietists usually ascribe to the father of evil: ignorance, intolerance, and injustice.
He flips the script.
Completely. If your religion is universally accepted, that's probably a sign it's politically useful and intellectually dubious.
Let's transition now from the political and social critique to the deep philosophical core of the apology. The problem of defining God.
The knowability question.
Right. If you can't define what you worship, the author argues you shouldn't worship it. And he uses this fantastic rhetorical device by quoting a Bishop Watson, who, while intending to refute deism, inadvertently provided arguments highly favorable to atheism.
The bishop's queries are lethal to the traditional concept of God because they highlight the inherent contradiction in trying to define an infinite supernatural being using our finite, material, human concepts. He asks listeners to consider a few things.
Let's go through them. The first one is, how do you conceive of an uncaused cause of everything?
Right. This requires breaking the universal rule that everything we experience has a beginning, a cause.
Okay, and the second, a being with no relation to time.
Exactly. The bishop stresses this means he is not older today than yesterday and not younger today than he will be tomorrow. This removes God entirely from our human concepts of existence or progress.
And the third one is a being with no relation to space. So he's not a part here and a part there or a whole anywhere.
Which means he must be absolutely everywhere and nowhere at the same time.
And finally, number 4, the existence of moral and natural evil if this being is simultaneously infinitely powerful, infinitely wise, and infinitely good.
The classic problem of evil. If he is all those things, evil shouldn't exist. So the author's ultimate question becomes, is it even possible to have experience of, or to even imagine, a being with attributes so strange, anomalous, and contradictory?
Trying to conceive of a God without relation to time or space immediately places him outside of all human capacity for comprehension. Our brains are material, temporal machines. How can we possibly process non-material, non-temporal existence?
That's Southwell's entire point.
Right.
We can't. And this leads directly to what he calls the reproach of idolatry. If a God is confessedly unknowable, if his ways are not our ways and his thoughts not our thoughts, then Southwell argues he is the merest figment of ill-regulated imagination.
He synthesizes this critique using the sarcasm of Minucius Felix, right?
Yes, applied to Christians. Not one of you reflects that you ought to know your gods before you worship them.
That is a staggering conclusion. That worshiping what is confessedly unknown is mere superstition. You're committing the intellectual sin of pretending to know something you yourself admit is incomprehensible.
And that, in the author's eyes, makes you an idolater. The Christian might reject a physical idol of wood or stone, but the author argues they are simply bowing down before the least tangible of all idols, a God without body, parts, or passions.
So to talk of or bow down to the incomprehensible is nonsensical.
And to pretend affection for it is worse than nonsensical. It involves the rankest hypocrisy. The sensible person is silent, the ignorant person believes, and the impostor triumphs.
The text then turns the accusation of blasphemy on its head, which is particularly provocative considering blasphemy laws were very real in 19th century England.
They were.
Lord Brougham defined blasphemy as requiring belief in the concept being insulted. Therefore, atheists lacking belief cannot logically blaspheme.
It's a sharp logical trap laid by the author. They can't insult a God they genuinely believe doesn't exist. He says the true blasphemer is the one who does believe, and yet invents a monster and calls it God, ascribing to it folly and wickedness.
He's arguing that theists are the ones insulting their own proposed deity?
Yes, by making him a creature of human passions, jealous, changeful, vindictive, partial, cruel, unjust.
He's referring to specific biblical narratives here, isn't he?
Absolutely. He specifically calls out the God of armies who authorized acts at which human nature shudders. He questions why a supernaturally wise and good being would proclaim the murderous adulterer David a man after his own heart, or command the wholesale butchery of Canaanites, sparing nothing that breathed.
So by defining God in these flawed, cruel, human terms, theists are the ones insulting the potential for divinity.
Not the atheist who simply rejects the entire contradictory concept. That's his argument.
The philosophical incoherence is driven home even further when examining the issue of materiality versus immateriality, especially within a key Christian ritual.
Yes. The Christian requirement of a God without body, parts, or passions is profoundly inconsistent with other core doctrines, like the Eucharist.
For our listeners who might not be steeped in theology, can you explain transubstantiation?
Of course, it's a doctrine central to Romanism and heavily debated in Protestantism. It's the specific belief where the bread and wine literally transform into the actual physical body and blood of omnipotence.
So the very God they define as bodiless and without parts must suddenly become intensely material for the purpose of a ritual.
Exactly. The ritual requires materiality, which drags the pure spirit God into the messy world of physics. And this is where David Hume provides some amusing, if profane, anecdotes to make the point about the resulting absurdity.
Tell us about the communicant who ate God the Father.
Well, Hume recounted the story of a communicant who, having received a hard counter instead of a wafer, thought he had eaten God the Father. He complained that the Eucharist was difficult because he was so hard and tough that there was no swallowing him.
That's certainly a literal interpretation of the body of Christ.
And then there's the story of the newly converted Turk. When asked by the bishop how many gods there were, the Turk replied, "None at all. You have told me all along that there is but one God, and yesterday I ate him."
The absurdity, as Southwell states, is pretty clear.
A God without body, parts, or passions could no more be nailed upon a cross than taken into the stomach. The system just collapses into itself because, while arguing for pure spirit, it requires material presence for its most fundamental salvation rituals. The philosophy and the practice are incoherent.
Okay, so if the God of the theists is logically impossible and full of contradictions, what rational system does the atheist put forward? It begins with a rule of philosophizing used by classical thinkers.
The rule of choosing the lesser difficulty.
And this rule is absolutely central to the atheist's construction of the universe.
It is. Of two difficulties, you choose the one that is least difficult to explain. Southwell argues that theists are violating this rule by choosing the greater difficulty, explaining the natural world by inventing the supernatural, which itself is inexplicable.
So how does the atheist apply this rule to the ultimate question of existence?
The atheist argues that believing nature itself to be the uncaused cause, or self-existent, is an infinitely lesser difficulty than inventing a self-existent supernature, a God to cause it.
In other words, inventing a creator who is harder to explain than the creation is just poor philosophy.
Precisely. If you must have an eternal existence, why choose the one that defies all human conceptual understanding?
This brings us to the eternal something paradox. It's the foundational point where everyone agrees and then diverges. Everyone agrees on two dogmas, something is and something ever has been.
Right. No one sane argues that existence just popped out of absolute non-existence. That's the solid starting point. The debate is what that eternal something is.
Theists say God is the eternal something who created matter from nothing, creation ex nihilo.
While atheists say matter, or the universe itself, is the eternal something, they reject the idea that matter began to be, or that creation from nothing is possible. They argue that nothing comes from nothing.
And the logic supporting the atheist's choice here is compelling.
It is. The author cites a Dr. Knowlton, arguing with what he calls irrefutable logic. He says, if an infinite God can exist from eternity without a cause,
Logically.
such world may have existed from all eternity without beginning and without cause.
Yeah.
If you accept the principle of self-existence for God, you have to grant it to the universe. And since we have verifiable experience of the universe and zero verifiable experience of God, choosing the universe as the self-existent entity is clearly the lesser difficulty.
If that reasoning holds, then the entire structure of natural theology, which relies on interpreting nature to prove God, becomes futile.
It does.
And the text then addresses the futility of the design argument, which is maybe the most famous classical argument for a creator, often championed by thinkers like William Paley.
Ah, the watchmaker analogy. The argument from design that the complexity of a watch implies a watchmaker, so the complexity of the universe implies a divine designer, is, the author contends, a sophism.
It begs the question.
It does. Shelley is cited, arguing forcefully that design must be proved before a designer can be inferred. We infer human design in a watch because we have prior knowledge of humans being able to construct machines. We have no such prior knowledge of a divine nature acting without hands out of nothing.
So the analogy fails because the watch and the universe operate under totally different laws of causality.
The analogy is fundamentally flawed, and the source illustrates this ignorance of causality with a fantastic, slightly humorous anecdote, the click-me toad.
Right. Tell us that story.
It's about a laboring man who, having never seen a watch before, finds one ticking. He runs to his neighbors, thinking the mechanical sound and movement meant it was a living creature, which he called a click-me toad.
And the neighbors, equally ignorant of clockwork.
Promptly smashed it because they were fearful of this strange ticking animal.
What's the philosophical takeaway from the click-me toad?
The moral is that ignorance leads directly to assumptions of strange supernatural causality. The man, lacking experience with human-made mechanics, assumed the ticking watch must be an animal.
And theologians, Southwell argues, are doing the same thing.
Exactly. They're similarly ignorant of the true natural cause of the universe's order. Instead of admitting they merely observe a combination of matter with an unknown natural cause, they invent a supernatural designer, a kind of celestial click-me toad. They are guilty of multiplying causes without necessity, which, the author notes, violates yet another rule of philosophizing, a rule for which they are indebted to Newton himself, ironically.
To hammer home the materialist position, the text introduces these powerful concepts of causation as change, referencing Spinoza and G.H. Lewis. This is dense philosophy, so let's unpack it.
Okay, so Spinoza's axiom is brought forward first. Of things which have nothing in common, one cannot be the cause of the other.
Let's translate that.
If God is pure, bodiless, immaterial spirit, and nature is pure matter, and they share absolutely nothing in common, then how is it logically possible for God to be the cause of material nature? Southwell is using classical philosophy to argue Christianity commits a fundamental logical error in its cosmology.
That immediately invalidates the entire concept of the creation story if your definition of God is immaterial.
It does. Furthermore, the author brings in G.H. Lewis's definition of cause and effect, arguing that they are merely relative concepts. Cause means change realized as effect. The two concepts are inseparable, operating within a continuous natural system.
So cause and effect are just a sequence.
Just a sequence. Lewis noted, the sequence itself is antecedent to some subsequent change, and the former antecedent was once only a sequent to its cause, and so on.
If causation is merely change within a sequence, what does that imply about a first cause?
It makes the concept of a universe being caused impossible. Since there could be no change before the universe existed, the whole idea of an external first cause loses its meaning. Cause and effect are merely relative conceptions, applying only to phenomena within the natural system, not to the system as a whole.
So the circular natural view of causation.
It renders the existence of an external first cause highly dubious, and it reinforces the atheist's belief that matter, or nature, is the eternal uncaused existence. It has always been changing, and thus always causing itself.
Having dismantled the philosophical basis for God, the apology returns to the political and moral consequences of religious belief, the dark fruits of piety.
And the virulence of zeal is illustrated through some truly shocking rhetoric used against atheists. This proves the intolerance isn't just philosophical, it's deeply personal and political.
Give us an example.
The source provides the genuinely terrifying example of John Ryland, A.M. of Northampton, a respected man of the church who declared atheists were driven by pride and lust and a desire to act the beast without control.
But he didn't just disagree with them.
Oh no, he unleashed a violent, total curse. He prayed that the fire, the moon, and the stars fight against him, and finally let the dull ass spurn him to death.
That's just vicious. This isn't theological disagreement. It's a public call for divine and natural forces to annihilate the unbeliever.
Precisely. And Dr. Balgai similarly called atheism, quote, such a monstrous contradiction of all evidence that it may well be questioned whether any man can really fall into it. This rhetoric serves the political purpose of classifying the atheist not just as wrong, but as fundamentally monstrous, inhuman, and therefore worthy of any punishment.
And even those known for moderation seemed incapable of extending that courtesy to unbelief.
Right, like Robert Hall, a widely respected divine who wrote an entire treatise on moderation, but he still applauded John Calvin for burning Michael Servetus at the stake.
He said what, exactly?
Master Calvin did well approve himself to God's church in bringing Servetus to the stake in Geneva.
That's a remarkable statement.
As Southwell observes, it proves that eloquence, learning, and faith are not incompatible with the cruelest spirit of persecution. He argues Hall's treatise on moderation is an everlasting memorial against its author. The hypocrisy reveals that for many, moderation applied only to other believers, not to the foundational threat of unbelief.
And the author suggests this bigotry is systematic.
He does. If Robert Hall, one of the best of his class, applauded a burning, then lesser illiterate fanatics would naturally harbor the same fire and faggot sentiments.
But Southwell goes deeper, analyzing the internal logic of faith that necessitates this cruelty, the logic of predestination. He argues that this doctrine, which arises from the nature of an omnipotent God, logically destroys all concepts of human justice.
Yes, if God is omnipotent and prescient, meaning he knows and controls everything, then everything, including sin, suffering, and political injustice, is preordained.
He quotes a Scottish tract, Electing Love.
That's right. It says God might have saved the whole world, but he did not, and thousands are now in hell. This logic removes human accountability because everything was compelled. The author notes that even the disgrace attached to Judas's memory has no foundation in human justice, as he was compelled to fulfill prophecy.
So in this framework, God becomes the author of all sin and suffering. This is the argument Southwell finds most damning, isn't it? That religious logic forces you to accept injustice as divine will.
It is the pinnacle of his critique. He argues that the consistent theist is forced to accept that God is a supernatural monster, a vengeful, pitiless, and almighty fiend. This consistency, though revolting, is the logical conclusion of infinite power and foreknowledge paired with real-world suffering.
And once this monstrous God is accepted,
Then human justice and compassion are rendered meaningless because suffering is simply part of the divine plan. This allows political cruelty to flourish under the guise of piety.
the apology then pivots to detailing Christian atrocities and hypocrisy, asking a very pointed question. Why are atheists' vices ascribed to their creed, but Christians' vices are not?
He uses historical examples to prove that piety and power are the true source of violence. The author cites Bartholomew Casas' computation that the Spaniards in America destroyed 10 million human creatures in just 45 years, often using religious conversion as the pretext.
And the details are gruesome.
Horrific. They were recorded hanging indigenous people 13 in a row in honor of the 13 apostles and giving infants to dogs for sport.
And the inquisitors, who Southwell describes as feasting while victims were burnt in the auto de fe.
The juxtaposition is stark. Piety and enjoyment of state-sponsored torture. The text asks, if atheists perpetrated such acts, who could doubt that their barbarity would be ascribed to their creed? Yet Christians, the authors of these genocides, were considered holy.
He also highlights the absurdity of the Inquisition's defense.
He does. They built their proof for burning heretics on interpreting a Bible verse about withering branches being cast into the fire. And they even claimed, preposterously, that burning people did not violate the maxim ecclesiae non novit sanguinem. The church sheds no blood.
How did they justify that?
Because to burn men is not to shed their blood.
The comparison is extended to Protestant monarchs as well, demonstrating that the problem is piety itself, not just the denomination.
Right. The author notes the hypocrisy surrounding the condemnation of Bloody Mary, while her sister Elizabeth's atrocities are ignored. Elizabeth burned 2 Dutch Anabaptists and used ripping up as a fashionable punishment for Catholics who refused her supremacy.
And Southwell calculated that, taking into account the rippings and burnings and roastings and hanging, the reign of good Queen Bess inflicted 100 times more human misery than that of Bloody Mary.
It's an exhaustive catalog of state-sponsored religious violence, and he uses it to argue that piety is inherently dangerous when it's tied to political power. The faithful are given supernatural justification for the most monstrous acts.
To counter the widespread fear that atheism causes political turmoil, the idea that without God, society just descends into chaos, the text offers Lord Bacon's historical counter-argument on atheism in civil times.
Lord Bacon, who himself abhorred superstition, made the crucial observation that atheism did never perturb states, for it makes men wary of themselves as looking no further.
If you believe in no afterlife, you're motivated to be prudent and wary in this life.
That's the idea. He noted that times inclined to atheism, as the times of Augustus Caesar, were civil times.
Conversely, the times inclined to religion are the times of true political volatility and atrocity.
Absolutely. Southwell points out that during religious periods, like the English Civil War or the era of the Inquisition atrocities, soared. During these times, over 100,000 witches were condemned, and the Inquisition committed tens of thousands to the flames. Bacon, though a religious philosopher, provides strong historical evidence that fanaticism and zeal, not godlessness, are the true destabilizers of political states.
So the piety that supposedly ensures order is, in fact, the greatest source of disorder and cruelty.
According to this argument, yes.
In the final section, the apology moves to a fervent call for intellectual integrity. Southwell focuses first on the silence of the sensible, what the author views as intellectual cowardice among non-believers who are too sensible to be pious, but too cautious to be honest.
These are the time-serving men of the world. They privately disbelieve the doctrines of the church, but publicly adhere to them because they fear giving a shock to prejudice.
And so they preserve a prudent silence, motivated by professional advancement or financial self-interest.
And in doing so, they ensure the perpetuation of error by refusing to speak the truth they know.
The author cites Mosheim's observation, which perfectly captures the danger of this silence. When danger attends the discovery of truth, the prudent are silent, the multitude believe, and impostors triumph.
And Southwell argues this moral and intellectual compromise is a crime against humanity. The worst example of this duplicity he gives is Synesius, a bishop of Ptolemais, who boasted that he was always a philosopher in his closet, but always a priest when dealing with the Mass.
A private skeptic and a public performer. That is described as execrable duplicity. It's an act of betrayal against the public they're supposed to serve.
It is. The author argues that the men best qualified by learning and intelligence to expose the truth about religion are precisely those who refuse to do so, thus acting as accomplices to the impostors. These philosophers, in their closet, laugh at our holy religion, and in their churches do them reverence. They sacrifice truth for safety and emolument, thereby guaranteeing that the political substratum of injustice remains firmly in place.
The text drives home the call for integrity through this powerful contrast between honesty versus piety, focusing on the needs of government and society.
The world, the author asserts, needs honest lawgivers and administrators, not pious ones. He quotes a Colonel Thompson, making a very hard-nosed economic argument about religious pretense.
What does Thompson say?
There never was a man that brought piety upon the board when honesty would do, without its being possible to trace a transfusion in the shape of money or money's worth from his neighbor's pocket into his.
That's a blunt connection between piety and profit, that the moment religion enters secular governance, it's usually because someone is looking to defraud the public.
It is. Thompson's point, which Southwell adopts, is that the object of mixing religion with secular questions is cant, and cant is fraud, and fraud is dishonesty. The apology concludes that the Orthodox prefer false piety to no piety at all, because they believe that without fear of God, there can be no genuine love of man.
A premise the author rejects entirely based on the evidence of the Hume paradox and the historical atrocities of the pious.
Exactly. The atheist demands we follow reason and experience, rejecting all that is totally unknown. The unknowable God, the inexplicable cause, and the politically controlling church.
We've explored the radical argument that to dismantle political injustice, one must first dismantle its religious foundation. Southwell's apology is relentless in connecting superstition to oppression, ultimately arguing that belief in the supernatural is synonymous with intellectual ignorance.
And that ignorance is the most valuable tool in the oppressor's political arsenal.
Absolutely. And that leads us to the final provocative thought, which echoes the philosophical claims of the work.
The material suggests that our imagination is entirely confined to the material world. It cites philosophers like Descartes and D'Alembert, who believe that our creative faculty can only imitate what is material and sensible. We can only recombine things we have already experienced.
If that's true, if our ability to conceive is limited to the material world,
then consider this. If we cannot truly conceive of a supernatural being without body, parts, or passions, and yet we invent one and give it attributes, are our loftiest theological concepts nothing more than what Lord Bacon described in another context? Quote, mere cobwebs of learning, admirable indeed for the fineness of the thread and work, but of no substance or profit. That is, are all gods merely human, natural inventions constructed from human fear and human limitations rather than transcendent reality?
a profound question to end on. If you can't conceive it, Southwell says, you shouldn't worship it. That wraps up this deep dive into Charles Southwell's 1846 An Apology for Atheism. Thank you for joining us on the deep dive.